This life isn't just made for me. I'll explain, won't you please implore me? This life is full of untold stories. This life is full of untold stories.
You gonna do it, aren't you? You gonna say mom, 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 mom? You gonna say mom, mom, mom? And then you gonna say me.
On May 11th, 2014, which was Mother's Day, I woke up to my kids crying. I went downstairs to take care of my kids, and I tried several times to wake him up, and he just wouldn't wake up. I could tell something was wrong. He wasn't himself. He didn't say one word to me. He wouldn't speak to me. I had plans to go to the winery that day with my mom and my Nana. So we went to my parents' house to meet them to go to the winery, and Chris stayed with the kids to take care of them. The only thing he had said to me so far was when we got there, he took my Mother's Day present out of the car and he threw it at me and said, "Here's your gift." And that's the only words he said to me so far. So we got home from the winery and I was hoping that he would be better by then, and he was worse than he was when I left. He got up in my face and started screaming at me in front of my family. When we got home, he helped me put the kids to bed, and then he went upstairs. From the beginning of our relationship, we had a rule that we would never go to sleep angry at each other. So I went upstairs and tried to talk to him, and he wouldn't respond. He wouldn't say anything. He just stared at the ceiling. I was just really confused on what was going on because my husband was usually a very loving man. He was a great father, a great husband, every single day. And so I was just really hurt and confused on what was going on. So I went downstairs and tried to calm down, and then I proceeded to go upstairs again to try to talk to him again, and still same thing, he wouldn't speak to me. So I started yelling at him that he needed to go downstairs and sleep on the couch because I wasn't going to sleep in the same bed as him when he was treating me that way. He still didn't respond. He hadn't said anything. He was just staring. It was just really, really strange. And so I got angry, of course, and I pushed his arm a little bit and I told him to get out of the bed. At that point, he snapped and he became a completely different person. There was no longer any part of my husband in this man. He tackled me to the bed and he was shaking me, and he was screaming at me that I had tried to choke him even though I just touched his arm. We rolled off the bed because I was fighting back, and we rolled off the bed and he was shaking me and slamming my head against the hardwood floor. And the whole time I was just so confused because this was not the man I married. This is not who he was. So I was able to fight him off of me and get back up on my feet. And he said that he was going to get my phone so I couldn't call for help. And that's when I realized that I actually needed help. Something was seriously wrong. So he ran downstairs to get my phone, and I chased after him. And before he had said that, he had flipped over our dresser and he had punched a window pane, so his hand was mangled and bloody, and there was blood all down the stairwell as I was chasing after him to try to get to my phone first. He got to it first and I tackled him in our living room and I fought the phone out of his hand. Now this whole time my two young daughters were sleeping in their bedrooms right next to the living room. I was hoping at this point that they were still sleeping. So I got the phone out of his hand and I ran back upstairs, and I climbed on our bed and I started dialing my parents' number. I know I probably should have called 911 at that point, but in that moment all I could think was I needed my dad. I needed my dad to help me. So I called my parents and my mom picked up the phone and I told her that something was wrong with Chris, that he had just lost it and he was no longer himself, and I needed someone to come help me. At this point, he walked up the stairs and he said, "Your parents won't be able to help you this time." He unlocked our lockbox and he got our loaded pistol out of the lockbox. He pressed the gun to my head, and he said he was either going to shoot me or himself, and he asked me which it would be. While he was holding the loaded gun to my head, he pulled a knife out of his pocket and he opened it up, and he was just nonchalantly tossing it up and down in his hand. And his eyes were just so cold and remote. The whole time my mom is on the phone with me, and once she heard him say that, she hung up and said that she was going to call the police. I can remember the way his eyes looked when he came back to himself and he realized what he was doing. He dropped the knife, and the knife hit the floor, and he threw the loaded pistol against the wall, and it broke into a bunch of pieces. And he walked into the other room, and I heard him loading a rifle. I sat there for a few minutes, and then I snapped out of it and thought, this is my chance to get away. So I ran downstairs and I grabbed my 19-month-old daughter out of her crib, and I took her in my 2-year-old daughter's bedroom. I put her on the bed with her big sister, and I shut the door and locked it, and I scooted furniture to block the door so he couldn't get in. My phone rang and it said Daddy on the screen, so I answered it, but it wasn't my dad, it was a police officer. My dad was on his way to help us, and of course he was speeding because he knew that I had a gun to my head at that point, and he got pulled over, at which point he told the officer what was going on, and the officer took his phone to talk me through the situation. There was a loud noise, and the police officer asked me if I heard the gunshot. I told him it wasn't a gunshot, that my husband either slammed a door or threw a piece of furniture. My family's hunters, and I know the sound of a .30-06 rifle going off, but I believe at that point God was just protecting my mind, because if I would have realized that a .30-06 rifle went off, then I would have known that my husband was lying dead upstairs while I was locked in a bedroom with my little girls waiting for cops to rescue us. I sat at the police station for 3.5 hours, not knowing what was going on. I didn't know if my husband had been hurt by the police officers. I didn't know if he had been arrested. I knew nothing. And the whole time I was just irrationally stressing out about if I had enough money to bail him out of jail and which psych unit I would put him in to get help. Eventually the police chief walked in, and I started bombarding him with questions about if he was okay, what happened, and his eyes filled with tears as he said the words that forever changed my life. Mrs. Deason, your husband is dead. He took his own life.
So what did you do to kind of help yourself through this and your girls afterwards? What kind of help did you?
Well, I think the main thing that helped me in the beginning was accepting the fact that it was his mental illness, and so therefore it wasn't my husband doing those things. It was his illness, and that took away, I never felt any anger towards him at all about what happened. I wasn't angry with him for holding a gun to my head, but I also wasn't angry with him for shooting himself, because after the fact I realized, I can remember the look in his eyes when he became himself again, and I realized that he just couldn't live with what he had almost done, that he'd almost shot his wife in a moment of insanity. And I just think that he couldn't live with the thought of that ever possibly happening again, or even worse, to his children. And that's why he took his life. As a single mom to a now 3-year-old, she turned 3 2 days after his death, and a 19-month-old, it wasn't an option to not get through it and to not be okay. I didn't feel like I could just give up and quit. So I started counseling right away, grief counseling, and also counseling with my pastor at the time. And that helped me through it a lot. I never held anything in, and I felt it as it came, and therefore I was able to deal with my emotions and not bury them to where they would come up later.
You processed as you went through.
Yes. I also started writing again. I had written a lot as a teenager, but being a mom to 2 little girls 16 months apart, I didn't do it much.
Yeah.
But that really helped me through my pain, because like I said, I can't keep anything in, and that was my outlet to get all of my pain and my feelings and my confusion out on paper. I also started a blog and was writing a blog as well, and that really helped the whole writing process.
Definitely, you're healing through creating and making
Yes.
art. Yeah. And I know you've done a lot of different things now with you're an author, you're published. I know you already were, but you've done even more.
Yes. Probably the most difficult thing for me to deal with besides that actual night was we had to move out of our house for 4 months because that whole portion of our house had to be torn apart down to the studs, 7 layers of flooring torn out, and everything in that portion of the house had to be thrown out and redone. So when we moved back into our house 4 months after the death, that was probably the hardest time out of all of it. PTSD symptoms started happening, and when my doctor told me that, I was really confused because I was like, I'm not a soldier, I didn't go to war. And he's like, well, what you went through can still cause PTSD. But I just had every single night, it was just nightmares after nightmares.
What kind of advice would you give to other people that have lost a spouse to suicide or illness like you have?
Well, I think as far as my advice would be with living with someone with bipolar disorder, which will kind of go along with the suicide, is to accept that it's their illness and to not take it personally. I know in the beginning I had a really hard time with his illness because I felt attacked constantly. And once I learned what it was and what his triggers were, it made it easier for me to put that in a different compartment, and I never took anything he did in those episodes personally. And overall, I think that helped with the suicide. They're not doing it to you. They're just trying to end the pain that they're going through, and they're trying to save you from having to deal with their illness.
This life isn't just made for me. I'll explain, won't you please implore me? This life is full of untold stories. This life is full of untold stories.